so actually, I made this PowerPoint and I never talked to John about it, but I know from having worked with him in the past, he's going to be very good at just jumping in, because I was pretty good at giving away money to historic preservation projects in my day, and he is very good at getting it. So together, I think we can paint a pretty good picture. Here's what we're going to talk about. We're going to introduce ourselves a little bit. I'm going to introduce the organization I currently work for. We're going to then talk about the use of the property, what's the project, what funding is out there, financing models, very simple financing models for very simplified projects. So all of this is super complex, but we're just trying to bring it down to a kind of understandable level so that the complexity is in the way. And then we're going to just talk about how you kind of evaluate the options for what financing you can get, what kind do you want to go after, what kind you want to leave on the table, and then kind of wrap up with some closing remarks. Okay. So I am, my name is Catherine Berger. I'm currently the interim president and CEO of Wisconsin Economic Development Association. This organization is a membership organization of about 350 people from across the state. They work for banks, corporations, utilities, developers, engineers, municipalities, counties, and community economic development organizations. So a vast array of people. Our programs include, the first one on the left you'll see, advocacy. So when Dinah and Matt were talking about the adjusted basis calculation, that the interpretation is different than it has been in the past, that is an issue that will matter to WIDA members throughout the state, and that our advocacy, our lobbyists, can take up at the Capitol with legislators, probably falling behind other partners who may have an interest in that as well. But we also offer academies on various topics and a network of banks that kind of invest in Community Revitalization Act eligible projects. So as an economic developer, that's how I became interested in historic preservation. I wanted to get projects done that mattered to local economies. And so, some economic developers are more or less interested in historic preservation as a financing tool that fits into their local economy or the fabric of their community, that strengthens the tax base, that builds interesting places for people to gather, can spawn new businesses, creates jobs, and mainly economic developers are about tax base. They're about generating income tax and generating property taxes for their communities. So historic preservation does all that, and that's why we care about it. Also, because it makes cool places, makes communities really great places to live. So there's just a network of these economic developers throughout the state and people who are members, and that band kind of in the middle, community government, local government, those are the people that are kind of at the heart of the work that I have done in my career, and those are the people that need to be involved in your project, if it's a job creation or a tax-based developing project or anything that matters to a community. The first thing that if you approach an economic developer that they will ask is, well, what's your project, right? And there are a couple of different ways that these sacred places could become a project. One of them is that you want to save a building for any use. So this building here in this picture was somebody who lived in Lake Mills, Wisconsin, and drove by that building all the time and said, I would like to see that building saved. And I'm in a building my business is in a building down the street, and we're outgrowing it. I would like to save that building and put my business inside of it. And so she could do that in a couple of ways. You can do that kind of project either through conventional or non-conventional financing. It's a kind of a commercial type deal. And then there's the kind that you want to save it for a continued religious use or a nonprofit use. And you would do that by renovating it for continued use as a church or a nonprofit. And you would do that. You can do that with or without significant and ongoing income generating use, and with or without historic tax credits. So the way that kind of looks to me is on the conventional financing side, the lady who saw the building and says, I want to put my business in there, she might have a business plan. She might go to her banker and say, here's my business plan. I have 25% of the cost of buying and renovating this building to put down, and I would like you to lend me 75% of that. If it works, her banker will say yes. If she's able to demonstrate financial ability to repay, adequate collateral, and also the experience that it would take to get it done. Then say you're the church and you just want to renovate your building. You have roof problems, you have mechanical problems, and you need $1 million or something. What are you going to do? You're going to have a capital campaign amongst your membership and donors, and you're going to go out to them and you're going to try and probably raise 100% of that $1 million you might need. And if you can't do it, you might at the very end take on, your bank might agree to lend you 25% of it, either based on pledges for future contributions and donations, or based on just your solid reputation and ability and solid operations and ability to repay a loan. But generally you try to raise all the money up front, and you don't, and you might take a long time to get that done. Then finally, the non-conventional. So that is where you are able to leverage other resources. You might, that 10% of other funding that can come through in-kind donations, grants, other kinds of programs. You would be able to reduce your debt if you're a nonprofit. You would be able to increase your debt, perhaps. And you'd have debt of maybe 40% or 25 or 40 to 65% equity, and all these other tools add up, and then you're able to get the project done that way. So when you're looking at these things, what kind of debt do you want, or what's the project, and can you do it? You have to kind of look at what's the feasibility of the project. What is the scope? What do you have to do? What do you want to do? Do you want to do it right, historic preservation-wise, or can you do it right, and what is that total cost? How financially healthy are you as a borrower? Are you running on a shoestring? Are you in decline? Do you have the experience to be able to get it done? And does your property or your organization generate enough revenue to keep paying back some debt? What kind of risks are out there for you? And that might include risk of a global pandemic, or an economic recession, or a flood in your downtown, kinds of risks that are prevalent today. How tolerant are you as an organization to be able to handle those risks? And then revenue generation potential. Where can you earn money to help? And Allison talked about this, how can we use this church during the day on the weekdays and leave it available for somebody to worship in on the weekend, for example? And finally, financially, what else is out there financially that we can bring into the project? You want to jump in at any moment? You just let me know.
You're rocking it.
Okay, I'm rocking it. All right, other considerations. What's the purpose of the project? What are you trying to accomplish? What are your goals? What are the goals of the project? And then how does that align with your mission and your purpose? You don't make a project that doesn't match what your organizational goals are. Then you don't try to shoehorn revenue generation into a project that you're not comfortable with. And I can think of a church that was thinking of renting out to a food pantry. And unfortunately, that church opted not to do it because they didn't feel comfortable having a lot of people coming and going from their campus. It's all individual, and the judgment of the people that are driving the project. Where will there be community support for your project, and what would the impact on your programs and services be? for implementing this project. If you implement it, will it strain your budget so much that you will not then be stressed financially and not be able to carry on with your programs and services that are core to your mission? So what funding is out there? That's kind of what we're talking about today. So community banks, I think, as sources of debt, John was saying, he can't get a big loan.
Right.
But for some of these smaller projects and for some that are located, in small towns, a community bank is the best bet. You may have a reputation with them. But the amount of debt depends on the nature of your project, the nature of your organization, and where you're located, and the sources of that debt that you can get for that debt. So community banks are probably generally where I would go these days if I don't need over $10 million, or maybe even $5 million. And because they're located close to you, they know your organization, they know your community. They may have more lenient underwriting standards, and it's local. CDFIs, Community Development Financial Institutions, have funds that they can loan out for community type projects as well. And that is usually lent out at a lower interest rate and a longer term. And they're willing to lend to inexperienced owners just because they're interested in the mission and what the goals of that project are and what that means to the community. And then in rural communities, USDA Rural Development is also a great source of funding. They have loan programs that are excellent and not too complicated to use. And the equity side, then, of course, if you are a nonprofit, you're going to try and raise capital, do a capital campaign from individual donors, members. You may get some grants from corporations or foundations. And that counts as equity. You may get investors. If you are a for-profit, you might take investors who are looking for a return from you, so they'll take a portion of an ownership interest in your project. And then, of course, historic tax credits, what we've all been talking about all day.
Let's see. I was just going to mention.
You want to go back?
Oh, no. So you're still going through some of these, but the community development financial institutions, those were pretty much created by Treasury, that CDFIs were taking money from banks that are trying to get money out into the community so that they could have a good CRA rating. A lot of banks got in trouble, before 1973 for taking deposits but not making loans into those communities. So that's why they're more willing to lend to more riskier ventures. But they also have the new markets tax credit program. So that's a Treasury program. So you can often approach a CDFI. Maybe they have some new market tax credits that sometimes equates to another 21% of dollars into your project that you don't have to repay, or like capital magnet funds. And then also wanted to mention, if you're working with a nonprofit and you're redeveloping, say, a church or another, like a community facility, Wisconsin has a really nice property tax benefit. If you're going to use the historic tax credits, you put the nonprofit into a limited liability corp, often you're going to be taxed. But we have a special exemption in Wisconsin that will allow you to still be tax exempt. So as long as you work with the State Historic Preservation Office to put an easement on the property, there's some conditions of it, but we've used this a number of times, the tax exempt property tax benefit.
There are other lists in this presentation of other sorts of financing. So, but there are just a lot of other sources, and up at the top is TIF and TID. Local funds communities have funds. Then for some energy type improvements, there is PACE Equity, and Focus on Energy has some funds for energy efficiency as well. Community Development Block Grant. WEDC has some great programs, including the Brownfield program, and then the last three are housing programs if your use is housing. So all of this really depends on use of the project, the conditions unique to each project and program and community. So does your project, overall you've got to determine how your project aligns with public funding. So when people like John used to come to me and say, hey, I have this project, and then I'd say, well, what's your project? And then they tell me, and then my wheels are turning. I'm saying, how does this align with a public purpose? What is the benefit to the community? So if you can speak that language when you're talking to your local government or other members of the economic development community, you need to speak that language. What's the benefit to the community? Is it an important project to the community? Is it an important place that means a lot to a lot of people, like we've talked about? Is there some economic or community development impact out of it, such as jobs or a place where businesses will spawn out of, or economic activity that's generated in a downtown, tourism? What is it that benefits the community? And then how does it align with the other part of the School of Architecture and Urban Planning? How does it align with community plans that may be in place? And so that's also important to do your research and know what the community has outlined for itself. What's their economy? How do they plan to grow their economy? How is the land use, and how does it fit into all of those future plans they may have? So public purpose, just as this is you got to think about what's your public purpose, not just because it's going to be a good project for you, but in order for public funding to be available, it should fit one of these categories. And then here is kind of another laundry list of different public sector resources. And I got to say, I came from WEDC. WEDC has some great programs that can subsidize some of these projects, probably more commercial or community in use, and including the Community Development Investment Grant or the Idle Industrial Sites Grant. Obviously, a church or sacred space was probably never an industrial use, but there may be some way that it fits into some of these programs, and as I said, it all depends on the unique properties of the project. So TIF or TID, just a quick primer on what that means. So it's kind of hard to see on here, but on the left bar is the existing amount that a property might pay in taxes. And for a church, they don't pay any property tax. So that, once it's reused into a tax-paying use, or a tax-eligible use, then that's the green bar, goes all the way up to there. So that you are borrowing against those future tax revenues that would be generated, or the community is borrowing against those future tax revenues, and they can get that back. Some communities will give it to a developer or owner up front, meaning I'll put this in now, today, and it will be paid back to me over time as you pay that increased tax increment. Or they will do it as a pay-as-you-go TIF, it's called, and that means that you build it, and they will give you a rebate every year of the amount of taxes that you have generated. Did you ever get TIF on any projects? Have you gotten any?
Absolutely. There's a couple of ways, that you can do TIF. It's the pay-as-you-go way, or sometimes just an outlay. But you have to sit with city TIF staff, as they're going to really underwrite your project just as much. We work very closely to create a state law that for townships that we're going to have an incorporation into a city, and so that there was going to be a plan that the state of Wisconsin could work with those types of municipalities to use TIF. So we use that on our Madison campus, but it's always, every municipality is going to be different in regards to if they'll do TIF or not. Some communities are great working with it, others are not so.
Yes, and that is part of WIDA, the organization I work for now, and I've been a member of for about 20 years. was founded 50 years ago and was instrumental in the passage of TIF legislation in 1975. So TIF is now 50 years old. So part of my job now is educating communities about TIF, and it's not a dirty word, it's a benefit for everyone. Then these revolving loan funds, and this is what John was talking about, that could be from a CDFI, or they could be from a local government or a county government. They're funded through TIF, they're funded through CDBG, they're funded by the EPA or general revenue. A community can put money in, a CDFI can put money in, and basically it's called revolving because they lend out the money, and then as it comes in and gets repaid, then they lend it out again. And so they are, as I said before, typically lower interest rate and less conservative underwriting than a private bank. Did anybody have insomnia like back in the 2000s ever? If you did, you would see this guy on late night television and he would say, you get a grant, you get a grant, you get a grant. And you're gonna give me a grant because I'm gonna give you a worthless book full of grants that you will never get, but I'm gonna sell it to you for $50. And this is, I worked for the government during that time, and it was very annoying. I could tell when people were looking at that book and calling me, and they thought I was trying to hide something from them. But there is really, it is a myth that there really is that the government has grants for everything that you might want to do with your life. You just need to know how to ask. Not really true. But that being said, there are some sources of grants that I've kind of outlined already that. The way you find these grants is by knowing the right people to ask, by telling your project story to everyone who's an economic developer, to your consultant team, connecting with as many people throughout your community who can help connect you with these resources, and telling a compelling story that helps them connect to your project, be willing to advocate for it, and be willing to help you find resources. Like John, with the lawyer, who just called him up and said, hey, that would be a great project for this $33 million or whatever they had left, or 15, whatever you needed, right? Yep. So that's how these things come to be. So this is just a list of the kind of economic development people, or people who touch economic development, who are good for you to have told your story to, who should know about your project. So just some really simple projects, and I say really simple because as you have come to appreciate today, if you didn't know before, there are a lot of complexities about all of it. So just say that this is that shop, that lady in Lake Mills, and she needs $1 million worth of work. This is how it looks, and it would typically take about 1 to 2 years. So that's with getting the bank approval, getting the plans and the construction and the everything in place, and the construction completed and occupancy. Maybe you can complete the project in 1 to 2 years. And this is when it works, okay? And that's not always easy to make happen, especially with an old building, because there are a lot of unknowns in old buildings and a lot of things that that need to be done in order to make them usable again. And then if it doesn't work, what do? Well, you got to reduce the scope or development cost to reduce the amount that has to be financed. And we all know that's not easy these days, right, John?
Right.
Or we have to implement it in phases. So you bite off as much as you can chew. You work it through the boa constrictor, work the water buffalo through the boa constrictor, and then you take another water buffalo and you work it through. So that's another way of doing it. Reducing the mortgage or financing costs by lowering the interest rate, lengthening the term, that's available through sometimes these non-traditional sources, and then increasing the equity that you have through donations, investors, grants, or tax credits. And And then finally, you can reduce the operating costs or increase your revenue to improve the cash flow of the project. And that isn't easy to do. I mean, there's a market rate. You can't go beyond what that might be. There's a point at which you can't charge more. So here's kind of a commercial, non-conventional, what it might look like. And I'm sorry, it looks like my decimal points didn't align anymore. But you'll kind of just see, it takes about 2 years as well. So you're gonna kind of try to get the state historic tax credit. Say you have, and why I say this is simplified because, we assume $1 million, and I just said all of that is qualified rehabilitation expenditures. I don't know that to be true. I assume that this property is eligible to get the tax credits, and I don't know that to be true either. In fact, I think this particular property was not eligible. However, you would really be able to benefit from that 20% tax credit, assuming that were the case. And 20%, and you sell of $1 million is 200,000. You sell those at 85 cents on the dollar, and you raise another $170,000 in equity. Then maybe you get a grant from your city facade program, depending on location, or a rebate from Focus on Energy, and then that ends up reducing the debt that you have to take on by quite a bit. From, what was that number we had before? 750 down to 350, or 550. So you're having 350 in traditional bank financing, and then the revolving loan fund, which has that longer term and lower interest rate. So it brings your debt service way down. And maybe it's the same timeline. And then here's what the typical one looks like I said. So it might take you 2 to 4 years to do this because you have to get your project scope. You have to go out to your membership and your donors and say, hey, how does, you have the quiet phase, you have the really a formal phase, and then you have commitments that are made for donations, and then members are like paying on their donations for a year. So by the time all's said and done, it might take you 4 years or more to raise that $1 million, depending on your situation. But with the same scope, you might be able to leverage the historic tax credit. Say you have some significant and ongoing income generation for your property, so you may be renting it out for events or renting out office. You then can raise only $580,000 in member contributions. You can get the tax credit and sell that for $170,000, and you still maybe end up taking on the same bank loan. But that kind of frees up some money for ongoing operations. So I won't read through all of these, but this is the same advice that everyone else has given you. You need to understand the approval process, so it's important to have a great consultant, especially if you're trying to use the historic tax credit. You need to have an experienced CPA, maybe an experienced lawyer on your team, depending on the complexity of your project. And then, get your architects and contractors in early. And that's also not to say that I'm not talking to your SHPO as well early. All right, then just how do you decide? Do you want public financing? What public financing? And there's just kind of a weighing of the costs and benefits. And I don't know, John, have you ever left money on the table?
Yes.
Tell me.
There are projects. Well, we're working on a project in Buffalo, New York right now. It's still on the table, but I'm losing a little bit of hope in it. Empire State, it's an old train station. They cost about $350 million to redevelop. It's the former Buffalo Central Terminal. Empire State made available $68 million for the project. We could not believe that amount of public resource available for this beautiful train station. And so, we went after that. We thought that, hey, first project in New York, and we won the RFP for it. But every which way that we look at the numbers, there's still between 120 and to 150 $million gap. So just because you're getting some public subsidy in your deal does not mean that it's enough to close the gap. But all the time, there's a lot of ARPA dollars that are still floating around out there. Green Bay wants to see some projects done. They had $4.5 million to get some workforce housing done. By the time the money needs to be spent, we really don't have enough time to put the other layers of public subsidy together. So often, there are dollars that are available, but if it's not going to make it work, it doesn't work, or else there's so many strings attached that you're never going to make it. So.
Yeah, I had, in my days at WADC, I had a number, and even when I worked at C.G. Schmidt, I had clients who were like, we're not doing that. We don't want the government in our business, and so they would not take the public resource, and that's their right. Of course, I was always disappointed that they couldn't. If they could make it happen without it, that's one thing. But if the project wasn't going to happen, that was the other thing.
Yeah, I was going to mention one other example that Dinah may recall, but I was the vice president of Goodman Community Center in Madison, and they ended up using federal and state and new market tax credits on the first phase, which was called the Ironworks building. The community center, really grew. Everybody loved it. There was another historic building that could be bought right across the bike path called the Brassworks building. That alone, in and of itself, could be put on the National Register, but the board and the donors decided to really expand the square footage quite a bit in order to make sure that it fit the space's needs. So we ended up not pursuing the historic tax credit because the addition would have really knocked it out of ever really getting a Part 2 approved. So we opted to not go, historic credits. We still respected the historic, building, the facade, and it looks like a fantastic facility. But sometimes if your space, needs, outweigh really the benefit for what you're trying to do for the next 30 years, sometimes it's good to leave those resources on the table.
Yeah, that's the alignment with your mission or purpose. Yep. That if you don't have it and the strings require you to divert from that, you should walk away. And then, so due diligence that you need to do. You just need to do the financial analysis for the project so that you truly know what the costs are, what's the scope that you want to do, and what you can afford. The strategic alignment with your mission or your purpose, like we talked about, and then, how tolerant of these risks are you? And don't forget, you need to consult with your experts. And that would also entail, I would say, making sure that you talk with your local and county and state economic development people, because they're going to also be great advocates for you who can help connect you with resources that will make the project go through.
I'm good. You said it all.
All right. That's all we have. Are there any questions? Hey, there's one.
I'm just curious on what happens to the project after it's finished, since there's more equity and less debt. Are there longer term owners, or is the building sold off to pay that debt?
Generally, the owners will stay in through the recapture period, because if you switch ownership during, say, the historic credit is a 5-year recapture, that will trigger 20% a year being called back. So owners really won't consider selling till you get your historic tax credit investors out of the development. But then it's really up for the owner to see if they want to do a long-term hold, if it still makes sense, or maybe it's better to offload it, get the equity out, and focus on other developments.
Okay, thank you very much.